He lost everything in one night. The sentence was small because the world he had built had been reduced to a single empty room where three small voices no longer answered. 10 years later, the cliffside house still held its dust like a wound that refused to close. The curtains stayed drawn, the children's toys lay on shelves like relics, and a faded photograph leaned against a mantel as if placed there out of duty rather than memory. Alexander Vale had made industries bend. He had once closed deals by the hour and raised skyscrapers from plans. But inside those walls, he moved like someone performing steps he no longer remembered the meaning of. People called him generous, efficient, untouchable. Inside, he felt like a guest in his own life. He had been born with hands that learned to work before he learned to ask for help. In a small apartment that smelled of frying oil and old books, his mother taught him that tomorrow only belonged to those who earned it. By 20, he had walked the factory floors at dawn and sat in boardrooms at dusk. By 30, he had the first of his companies and the kind of confidence that passed for certainty. He married Sophie because she laughed at the same private jokes he had stopped telling anyone else. They had Ethan and Lily and a bright new voice that filled rooms with messy joy. Then the night of the accident came like a stone through glass and left nothing but the echo. 10 years of careful building had not bought him protection from how sudden silence could be. The loss carved him into a man who negotiated survival more than happiness. He moved through schedules and statements and charity events with a polite absence, as if his grief were a business risk to be managed. He refused interviews, kept the mansion on the cliff shuttered, and allowed Mara, his longtime housekeeper, to leave a teacup where it would be found, because he could not face deciding where to put things away. Daniel Reed stayed, making clumsy jokes and bringing practical plans. Olivia Park handled the press with crisp statements. Marcus Holt kept legal tangles clean. Elena Brooks checked in with a casserole and a smile. These people formed the scaffolding he used to keep breathing. They knew better than to ask about names he would never stop saying inside his head. Yet even in his isolation, there were holes that practical measures could not fill. The ruin of that night had given him a reputation as a man who had everything and had nothing at all in the same breath. The newspapers called him recluse, the markets called him steady, and the house called him home only by inertia. The sound of the refrigerator was a loud companion in the kitchen where no little shoes could be heard. Each morning he woke to the same light leaking through the blinds and counted time by the slow, shy movement of dust motes. He had not promised the world to anyone anymore. He had promised to survive. The accident came in the first pages of the local news and in the slow, certain announcements of hospital corridors. The paramedic had said the word that rearranged 10 years of life. At the emergency entrance, Dr. Singh had held his hand with a care that was technical and human at once. The smell of antiseptic filled his nostrils so completely that it sat on his memory like a label. In the chapel of the hospital, a priest spoke in tones that sounded distant, and Mara arranged flowers as if following instructions from a play she had not agreed to perform in. He watched 3 small coffins pass beneath a sky so blank it felt like a conspirator. Journalists hovered outside the gates, their lenses like small, hungry eyes. Moment of tension 1. The car crash replayed in his head and on the faces of those who attended the funeral. He remembered glass like confetti, light refracting into shards of time, and his own voice a thin wire stretched to breaking. Inside the chapel his knees ached, the wood pews pressed impressions into his palms, and the rain on the roof tapped out a rhythm that mocked the irregular beat of his heart. People spoke softly, and names were repeated like talismans. When the 3 coffins were lowered, he felt a particular cold that was not the weather. It was the certainty that the future he had imagined had been taken from him. He could not have known then that absence would become his closest companion and his fiercest teacher. The days that followed were lit by screens and quiet dinners eaten alone. Olivia arranged statements to the press that said the right things in the right order. Daniel sat with him at the kitchen table and placed a hand on his shoulder in the way of men who could not find words. Marcus handled the estate with mechanical competence, and Elena kept bringing over bowls of stew as if warmth could be handed over in a ceramic dish. The house resisted being cleaned because to clean it would mean deciding that the past belonged to shelves and not to him. He let it remain a museum so that grief would have a shelter and not be forced to crowd the rest of life. 10 years of this created new measures of time, a calendar with pages turned politely without intention. The staff knew subtler cues than anyone realized. Mara left a blanket unfolded on the sofa because she knew he slept there sometimes. Nurse Claire, who volunteered at the hospice, came to sit on the terrace and watch the sea because she said it soothed something in him. Daniel had been the one to say, without sugar, that there was a practical option if Alexander ever wanted to try living rather than merely sustaining. He had said that a contract could be less messy than a plea. He had meant provision, not passion, and the idea lodged into Alexander like a seed that had been waiting under snow. The notion was cold at first, a legalistic solution to a house full of memories. Block 3 ended in routine, like the slow lowering of a curtain. A calendar on the wall had dates penciled in for charity lunches and shareholder meetings, and a single date in red ink that he circled once each year. He had learned to perform at public events, where a smile was a requirement, and a question about private life a test to be deflected. He was competent, reliable, and very alone. Daniel came one evening with an envelope and an easy appetite for pragmatic solutions. They sat in the library where the air smelled of old paper and lemon polish. He proposed an arrangement that had been used before by families who needed structure more than sentiment. The idea was simple, a contract marriage that would answer practical questions. Someone to manage the home, someone to be the face at charity events, a person who could be a mother if children ever returned. Daniel spoke in the language of plans and contingencies and used the words safety and steadiness. The first dialogue was a slow exchange. Alexander said quietly, "Why would anyone take that on?" Daniel replied, "Because some people are practical, because some people need work, shelter, and security, and because you could give them something they need." Alexander asked, "How do you even begin to find someone who agrees to that?" Daniel answered, "You start where the work starts. You offer fairness. You do not promise what you cannot deliver." Alexander shook his head. "I am not good at pretending." Daniel looked at him hard and said, "Then do not pretend. Do what you can do and let the rest be truth in action, not in words." Alexander would later call that meeting the map that changed his path. Their conversation expanded into particulars. Marcus noted legal safeguards. Olivia advised on public perception. Elena offered to help vet candidates. Mara insisted on someone with steady hands and a calm voice. Names were discussed. An architect of a life assembled with the same precision he applied to towers and spreadsheets. The plan was not a betrayal of memory. It was an attempt to open a door without pretending to forget who had been lost. Daniel said, "You do not need to fall in love again to let a life in." Alexander answered, "Maybe love will never come, and maybe that is not the point." Daniel smiled, as if that admission was enough to begin. The invitation to Charity Gala arrived like a small flaring of color in a gray season. The event hall smelled of perfume and candle wax and food that was artfully arranged and never touched. Alexander arrived as one did at public functions in his world, in a monocon. Tailored suit and with people orbiting him with polite distance. Isabella Cruz entered later with a quiet light on her skin and a practical bag at her shoulder. She was a social worker turned program director who had moved with purpose rather than show. Her dress was unassuming, her laugh a small bell, and her eyes the steady brown of someone who had learned how to fold hope into work. The room had a buzz of crystal and soft conversation, and when she reached the table where he stood, the air seemed to shift toward clarity. Moment of tension, too. Cameras found them quickly, the rumor mill warmed, and there were murmurs of curiosity and speculation. She offered a straightforward hello, and he returned it with the economy of someone who knew the power of small gestures. Around them, waiters moved like quiet boats, and a string quartet filled the corners with warm sound. The press whispered. Olivia intercepted a photographer with a practiced smile and a brief explanation. Alexander felt the old reflex to close and watched instead as Isabella sat and asked about the program, the children, and the ways the foundation measured effect. She asked direct questions and did not ask where she fit into the empty rooms of his life. There was no flirtation, only a peculiar recognition of utility and need that both found, oddly, comforting. Their conversation at the gala became the hinge. He asked, "Why are you here?" She answered, "Because there are children who need someone to fight for them." He said, "That is a common line." She said, "It is only a line when nobody does the work." She leaned forward and described after-school programs, protective housing, social workers who stayed when it got hard. He listened because she spoke like someone who had seen the worst and chosen to act rather than to pronounce it. She said bluntly, "I am not looking for shelter. I want to help." Alexander said, "Then let us start with that. Can you help run our program?" She said, "And what would that lead to?" He asked. She shrugged. "I do not know." That was the honest answer he had not heard in a long time. At roughly 1/3 into the story, pause for a moment. That reaches out to you, the viewer. If you have ever felt the world narrow to a single room and wondered how anyone moves forward from that place, you know the ache he carried. Imagine someone offering a doorway that is not bright with promises of easy healing, but practical and steady and modest. What would you do if someone came into your life offering a second chance without promises of love? Would you accept a practical arrangement for the sake of companionship and structure, or would you step back and protect the memory of what was lost? Right, "I would accept if you think you would consider a practical second chance," or right, "I need time," if you would hesitate. Share your choice not to decide for you, but to show others who read that different responses are possible and that there is no single correct answer. Your comment can be a small light for someone else who is learning to count days again. Now back to the story. The conversation at the gala that night set in motion a sequence of visits, plans, contracts, and the quiet negotiation of boundaries. The months that followed were made of small legislations of life. Isabella accepted a role overseeing a foundation initiative funded by his company, and part of the agreement included living on the property part-time to manage the program and provide the domestic steadiness the house had lost. She moved in with a suitcase, a measured patience, and a list of practical chores. They signed papers that protected both their interests and named responsibilities with neat legalese. Staff like Mara and Nurse Claire adapted quickly to a new person in the house. Marcus adjusted estate oversight. Olivia framed the narrative for the press in ways that emphasized charity and social good. The home felt different, not because the curtains were opened, but because someone else had taken to walking through it with purpose. Block 6 contained the day-to-day with an economy of detail. She noticed small corners he would not visit, and she sat at tables he had not used in a decade. She was not intrusive. She did not demand that he tell his story. She simply cooked and sorted and asked practical questions about legal forms and children's programs. She found a child's drawing tucked behind a book, and instead of remarking, she placed it on a side table where he would see it without being forced to face it. He noticed the small changes, like the way the kettle boiled to a soft whistle and how someone else filled his mug in the mornings. He watched her hold the door for a delivery man, the look in her eyes that did not search for approval, and began to catalog ways in which she made the house less heavy. Their conversations at night were cautious and full of pauses, until one winter evening they rearranged the living room to open a space where he could sit with the sunlight that slipped through the blinds. He said, "It is strange to let someone else move the furniture." She replied, "People leave imprints in rooms, even when they are gone. You are allowed to let new shapes into your space." He looked at her, and the weight behind his words was an old grief. She did not feel it, but she warmed it like a tea. That night they talked longer than they had in 10 years, and the exchange revealed small truths. They had a first night that was not a surrender, but a wary closeness, two people finding a way to be near. He admitted fears aloud. She touched the scar on his palm with a fingertip as if testing a fragile bridge. They traded memories in stilted confessions and managed to laugh at private absurdities. Afterward, he walked the corridors where the children's doors still hung with names, and he stood listening to the echo of his footfall, as if it might tell him whether this was forgiveness or betrayal. He chose to keep moving. Moment of tension 3 occurred when a tabloid suggested impropriety, and the press smelled a story about a wealthy man taking advantage of a worker. Olivia faced the cameras with a calm she had practiced. Alexander stood beside her, as if the two of them were the same image, one practical and one protective. Inside the house, there were whispered conversations with Marcus about contracts, and with Daniel about whether the plan had been a mistake. Outside, the phone messages were sharp, and the charity board wanted assurances. Isabella faced it quietly. She met a reporter in the garden and said plainly, "I am here to do the work, not to be a headline." Her refusal to dramatize became a protective wall that shielded them both, and slowly the rumor lost its teeth. Then came the news that altered everything again. During a routine check, Isabella found herself holding a test with 2 lines. The clinic smelled of coffee and bleach, and a nervous receptionist smiled with the weary kindness of someone who had seen many people's lives tilt. Dr. Priya Singh came with measured warmth and explained choices, risks, joys. They learned that there were more than one heartbeat, 3 in fact, tiny drums that beat in close harmony. Alexander felt a rush of air, like someone opening a window in a room he had kept closed for a decade. The discovery was impossibly joyful and terrifying in equal measure. Block 8 expanded. There were scenes in waiting rooms, tastes of hospital coffee, the metallic tang of fear, and the soft cotton of patient gowns. Conversations multiplied between Alexander and Isabella, and between them and Dr. Priya Singh. They decided to prepare the house for new lives, with the same precision he had once applied to towers. Marcus drafted new guardianship clauses, Daniel sketched a timetable, Mara ordered tiny linens, Nurse Claire volunteered supplies, and Olivia prepared a softer public message. They painted rooms with colors chosen for calm and laughter. They measured windows for curtains that would let in morning and not harsh noon. They filled a chest with tiny garments and old toys repurposed. Each action landed like a small repair on the hollow place inside him. Dialogue in this phase lengthened into care. Isabella said, "I do not want to romanticize danger." Alexander answered, "I only want to be present." She said, "That will be enough." He asked, "Will it be enough for them, for us?" She said, "We will learn as we go." He promised, "I will be here for every appointment, for every night, for every feeding."
He will be here, and his voice had a steadiness that surprised him and steadied her. They argued sometimes about choices, but always returned to shared lists and practical plans. The house began to accept noise in theory before the noise arrived. Moment of tension 4 came during birth. The delivery room was a world of bright lights, the squeak of rubber against tile, and a chorus of machines bleeping. Isabella was brave and fierce, and when one monitor flattened for a breath, the room held its collective breath with a sound that was physical. Alexander felt his hands go numb with a fear that mirrored the past, and yet here there was a chance to change the ending. The resuscitation team worked like a choir, and then the first tiny cry came like redemption. 3 small lives announced themselves in succession, and the sounds filled the sterile space with heat and chaos. He held Isabella's hand, and she squeezed back like someone anchoring both of them. They named the babies after small, meaningful things. Ethan Jr. for a laugh, remembered, Lila for light and hope, and Mateo for a future none of them could predict. The first weeks were an explosion of schedules and tenderness. Diapers were changed with more precision than he had ever afforded a business plan. Mara knitted tiny caps that smelled of wool and old houses. Nurse Claire taught them how to swaddle and how to listen for patterns in breathing. Daniel installed baby gates at dawn with clumsy tools and a proud grin. Olivia arranged a private photographer to document firsts, not press-ready versions, but quiet pages to be kept in a dresser. The house no longer felt like a museum. It felt like a shelter that had reopened its doors. The epilogue arrived not as a tidy closure, but as a sequence of small seasons. 1 month later, mornings were measured in feeds and naps. Alexander woke to the smell of warm milk and to the sight of Isabella moving through the nursery like a conductor. He knew which cry meant hunger and which meant a dream needing comfort. The mansion echoed with tiny footsteps on newly placed rugs, and boxes of toys that had once been curiosities now were necessary props in a life he had not expected to inhabit. He sat on the floor and built blocks with hands that had been used to signing agreements, and found a different fulfillment in seeing a small tower tumble into delighted shrieks. 3 months in, the public narrative softened. Olivia curated a simple statement about family and foundation goals. There were still prying questions, but less hunger for scandal and more interest in the foundation's work. Alexander taught the babies to babble his name in clumsy syllables, and he learned to leave meetings early to catch the last feed before evening. Isabella had developed a fierce competence as a mother and program director, and the two of them began to sew.
Share quiet approvals across crowded rooms. Mara organized a small birthday for the babies with neighbors like Elena bringing over pies and Marcus offering practical gifts of carved wooden toys. The house began to laugh without apology. 6 months later, the household had settled into a rhythm that was messy and alive. The cliffside garden smelled of summer, the kitchen held the sweet tang of preserves, and the rooms kept small, messy traces of lives that had been welcomed. Alexander walked through the nursery and touched the painted walls, and though sometimes a name would arrive like a cool wind and he would stand still for a breath, he had learned to let room for new noise. Isabella and he had not promised the world to each other. They had promised presence and action, and in that promise, something like love had room to grow. People still asked about loss and memory, and he answered honestly that he had not forgotten and had not replaced. He had allowed life to add new chapters without erasing old ones. He realized the house had not healed him so much as given him a place to practice being alive again. The contract that had begun their arrangement remained a document on a shelf, but it no longer defined the content of their days. They chose small rituals, a shared morning coffee, a child's bedtime song, a weekly walk where they would talk about what had been difficult and what had been joyous. Alexander's hands had become steadier at holding a bottle than at signing a solitary contract, and he had learned that the measure of a life could be found in the noise of children and in the patience of someone who stayed. If this story reached you in a place that aches, remember that second chances may come as practical offers, as quiet arrangements, as people who show up with lists and patience. To rebuild does not require forgetting. It requires room and willingness to let new things take root. The house on the cliff never erased its past, but it learned to hold more. If this narrative stirred something in you, consider subscribing to follow more stories that explore loss, resilience, and the slow work of putting a life together again. Share in the comments a single word that says what re-beginning feels like to you. Hope, courage, wonder, or maybe fear. And by sharing, you help others know they are not alone. Thank you for listening to this tale of a man who rose from his own ruins to find that riches can include small hands and ordinary mornings.